Welcome. I'm James Calicut, Waterfowl and Upland Game Bird Extension Specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Game Bird University. All right. Welcome, fellas. We got Dr. Heath Hagy back with us again. And this time we're again going to be talking about ducks. So we left Mark out of this. We let him have his one duck episode with us, so he could get to conversate and catch up with Heath here. But Heath, we're really excited to have you back, talk ducks a little bit more. And so for those that didn't listen to the last time Heath was with us, Heath is the project leader for the Habitat and Population Evaluation Team with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Got that right? Okay.
That's right. Based in Bismarck, North Dakota. That's right.
It's a mouthful, so I had to practice it a few times, before we started the last time, make sure I had it right. So
you could just say the HAPIT office, right?
The
we
HAPIT.
need another acronym.
There we go.
He happens to be the HAPIT.
Yeah. Heath, last time we had much kind of different conversation that wound up leading into the conversation that we're going to have today. We started out last time discussing, shifts and distributions of ducks and such, and then we kind of started talking about it from the flyway, administrative flyway scale down to kind of local levels. People, talking about, well, I'm not getting the ducks I used to, and we started talking about changes and things that could facilitate that, whether that's landscape change around a place or other things that can influence the duck holding capacity of a landscape. And one of those that kind of led us down towards talking about sanctuary and its role in helping support local populations of ducks, and whether or not that's not only holding birds in the landscape, but making birds available for harvest as well, for hunters and things like that. So I think today's conversation, let's just chat anything and everything, sanctuary, hunting disturbance, and all the things. Because to me, I don't think, of all the things I can think of that we try to investigate as duck biologists, I don't think there's a harder thing to look at and evaluate and really come away with some real good management implications than trying to evaluate that role of that function of sanctuary or that role of hunting disturbance and trying to find that right balance in those things. So I think we've got quite a lot of different directions we could take this today. So I'm excited.
I am too. A pleasure to be here again with you, James and Brian. Appreciate you having me back. Just as a sort of preamble, it's really interesting. Sanctuary, one of the most widely implemented waterfowl management strategies by private individuals, state and federal agencies, so on and so forth. One of the least researched pieces of management that we do. There's a little here and there, but as you pointed out, from a functional role, how does it benefit populations? How does it influence distribution, so on and so forth? Wow, we just don't have a lot of information to draw from. We'll dig into that a little bit today.
So I guess I'm trying to think of the best place to start here, because there is so many different ways that we could skin this cat. Maybe kind of talk about maybe what is our primary goal for when we're that we think we're doing when we put sanctuary on a landscape. What is and that probably looks a lot different whether you're talking about you're wearing a Fish and Wildlife Service hat and having and on a refuge, or whether you're at a wildlife management area with a state agency, and obviously the different stakeholders and missions of those groups. Maybe that intent is maybe different. But what do you think is probably the primary reason that we really kind of talk a lot about sanctuary and use it as a tool?
No, the last time I was on, James, you told me that I couldn't say it depends. So I want to know if that restriction is still in place for this time.
That was Mark's rule. Mark's not here.
Okay, good.
We can depend it all day long. We can.
Well,
It's usually my answer to my class is it depends.
That's exactly right. Maybe a good place to start would be sort of the definition of sanctuary, because it's a term that lots of people define different ways. People use different terms, refugia versus a refuge versus a sanctuary, so on and so forth. To me, and in the scientific literature that we do have, sanctuary is an area that is free from human disturbance for a significant period of time. There are certain definitions out there: 30 days, 60 days, the entire period in which a duck might be in an area in the winter, but a long time. I think it's fair to say, in my opinion, is that we shouldn't call something sanctuary on a non-hunt day, a couple of days a week, right? If we're going to hunt something 4 days a week, that day is not sanctuary, that you're not hunting there. Or if there's, lots of bird watching going on, or other recreation kinds of things, an auto tour through an area. To me, that's not really biological sanctuary. That's a lot of human disturbance that's still going to impact the way ducks use an area. So when I think of sanctuary, I think of a place that is mostly off limits to people, other than, people maybe from a long distance looking through spotting scopes at an impoundment, or, once a week someone's got to run through there and check a water control structure. But we pretty much leave that area alone. Not only do we not hunt it, but we don't go in there. The birds can just, whether there's food there or not, the birds can go sit, hang out, and just be in a safe space. And so I think that's important to sort of get out of the way, because there are different opinions of that. And some people might say, oh, I'm providing half of a place we hunt every day. Well, it's half sanctuary because I don't hunt at night. Well, not, the research says that's not going to be used the same way that an area that has sanctuary. But I'll stop. But Brian, what do you think on that definition of sanctuary?
It depends. No, you're right. It's probably been an evolution in thinking. You think back to the late 1800s. Everybody's worried about overharvest, and then you think about agricultural practices, and you think of things like rice harvest, and there used to be bundles of shocks, rice shocks in the field, and it was all they could do to keep birds off of them. And probably back then, the evolution of thinking was, we've got to limit depredation of rice by ducks, so let's build refuges, let's build Gray Lodge Wildlife Area. I mean, that was, those things were begun to be set aside, I think, to alleviate, crop depredations, because we can't, farmers can't have their crops eaten, things like that. And of course, harvest. So probably the mentality way back was at least two things. One, kind of limit, waterfowl as pests, depredation of crops on private lands. I mean, the way they farm then compared to now is night and day, right? So lots of crop depredations, and at the same time, all the habitat loss and sort of the evolution of thinking about safe spaces, and refuges. Probably not near the buzzwords then that we have now, but it just seems like those two components were important, and so, it's almost logical with us waterfowl hunters and waterfowl biologists. It's like we love these birds so much, and a big reason why we're all motivated to do conservation is we grew up hunting them, and yet it's almost like this selfish trade-off, right? It's like, hey, we want to create all this habitat so we can fill our freezer, but yet, by God, we do not want to reduce populations through hunting, so let's build sanctuaries, So I think those, treatments of it or acknowledgement of it are probably all across the board. It's probably a little bit of both. It's like this, man, I want more ducks. I want more birds in the freezer, but I want more self-preservation, And so I think inherently through the decades, we think, and maybe we have, I'll just say it. I can't imagine a landscape without waterfowl sanctuaries. I think there's a lot of adaptable birds that will find safe space, but good Lord, I'm glad we do have what we have. Whether it's enough or not enough, I have no idea. But the fact that it's out there at least, gives us an opportunity to say, hey, we're trying to acknowledge the birds' needs and things like that. And it is interesting, when working in California many moons ago, Mike Miller would always say, hey, the pintails will show up here August 1st. And that blew my mind, because August 1st in the Sac Valley of California is hot and dry as a needle, and yet here come the pintail. And what was even more amazing it's almost 3 months from the first gunshot goes off. You sit out there in the evenings and those birds are nocturnal. They're flying around at dusk. And it's almost like, is that an anticipation of being hunted? They've been hunted for eons and that's just what they do? Or are they just nocturnal creatures by habit? And maybe we've made them more so through hunting. So it's really kind of interesting. I mean, you watch pintails fly around in the evening looking for whatever they're looking for in August. It's like, whoa, is this a hunt related disturbance response, or is it just the nature of the beast? I think there's a lot of, probably still a lot we don't know. Certainly we don't know if we've got too much or not enough sanctuary.
Yep.
But anyway, those are just maybe some 1,000-foot views.
I think those are really, really good points. And I'll emphasize a point that you made, Brian, and that's that there are a lot of different reasons that entities use sanctuary. Some are very well thought out at times. Others, I think, it feels like the right thing to do to have some safe spaces. And that was probably the primary motivation. For instance, I support the National Wildlife Refuge System in my position primarily. And, we have many refuges where inviolate sanctuary is a refuge purpose tied to funding an establishment of the refuge. And so, but that is what we're going to do with a large portion of the refuge because it's the purpose of the refuge. So you go back and, well, why did we implement that? Well, it's because we thought that waterfowl populations were in trouble, and at times early on in the 20th century, they certainly were. And so it was a biological issue. Later on when we had recovery of populations, I think probably another primary motivator for sanctuary was to ensure that we had sort of stepping stones of habitat that was dependable, not just safe, but where we would establish a sanctuary, we would generally manage it for moist soil or ag crops or bottomland forest or whatever. It would be a dependable place that would have water on it and a bird could stop. And then, what we're thinking about, today is much more the social aspect, the hunter retention, recruitment, reactivation aspect of that, especially with agencies. And we want to try to make sure that we have these nodes of habitat that have sanctuary as a component. And that's the hub of a wheel, and birds can radiate out from there to be experienced by people, both hunters, bird watchers, so on and so forth. And so I think, to Brian said, it's probably been an evolution over time. And I think there are probably a variety of reasons that sanctuary makes a lot of sense as a management practice. From the biological side, make sure we save some of those birds and send them back to the breeding ground so we have more birds next year from a sustainable harvest standpoint. And also to spread birds across the landscape so they're available for harvest and for enjoyment.
Yeah, it's almost like our own safety net. I don't know if this is fair or not, but, think about states or the Fish and Wildlife Service that buy, 10 or 20 or 100,000 acre pieces of property for the next great waterfowl thing. And, can we look ourselves in the mirror and say, hey, we're going to hunt 100% of this? We love hunters, and it's almost inherent that it's like for decades, like the 60-40 rule or 70-30. And,
right.
And it's like we mean really well and are probably doing well on various fronts, but we really have no idea like what effect. And at the end of the day, we're interested in movements and habitat use, but ultimately what matters is the demography, right? How many birds survive, how many pass on genes or recruit young, and how much of that is a function of sanctuary. I have no claim to fame on that. I don't know if anyone does, but it's, in thinking we've got to be having some benefit. But, when you do these proportions and buy these new places, it's almost like, hey, we're really not a conservationist unless, we set aside some portion of this land. It's like we're doing our due diligence, So I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out there, but
yeah, and that brings up an interesting point, Brian, because I think even within the waterfowl management community, probably have a lot of varying opinions on sanctuary, and it's one of those topics that we can't all agree on. And so when you're talking about what you were just saying about like we acquire the next great duck property and thinking about does that need if we're going to hunt it or not. I think that's where a lot of people would get in there. Do we need more sanctuary in a certain area? Is that really going to create more opportunity for harvest if that's what we're pushing for, or is there some balance in there between amount you can hunt or at certain frequency and still have, the benefits of some degree of sanctuary and violent sanctuary on that area or what have you? But I think that's probably where a lot of biologists get into it is like, well, if we, I think everybody would certainly agree, like back to our conversation the last time you were here, Heath, about the, postseason water being an issue and, what's that doing to birds as far as from a cross seasonal effect standpoint of body condition and other things, these refuges as we acquire them, having those along the way is that dependable habitat that you talked about. That I think everybody would agree on that. But I think if you've got enough duck biologists in the room, you probably have a lot of different opinions on whether or not it should be sanctuary or, hunted or what have you. I think sort of like laid out that kind of, because that's what a lot of folks would do. You would have, varying opinions on some of that too. So like, do we need more sanctuary or, that sort of question there? I know that's a loaded question and probably not very well stated, but.
You waiting for me to answer that question, Jay?
Well, not really answer the question, but, just maybe speak to that point that there is quite a bit of that kind of, mentality out there for sure. I mean,
I don't think we know, to Brian's point about demography and we don't know at this moment how the amount of sanctuary in the home range of a mallard in the winter or during migration impacts their survival. We don't know how it really impacts their recruitment, right? Or recruitment the next year from those individuals, their fitness overall. And so that's something that, would be very challenging to estimate, but I think there are a bunch of duck biologists throughout universities and in agencies that would really love and are thinking about how to answer those questions. I don't know from a survival rate, from a demography standpoint, if we need more. I do think that continuing to go along that evolution as Brian talked about and think about our conservation planning and where do we have holes where maybe, there are plenty of birds in the larger area, but there's not that good node right here. And if we had some sanctuary and we had some hunted area, public hunted area around it and private land hunted area around it and opportunities for viewing birds in the sanctuary that, didn't affect them, so on and so forth. Are there some opportunities to add more and maybe spread some birds out and again, it kind of contribute to that social factor? Absolutely. Yep. I think there's absolutely opportunities to do that. We're just getting here. We talked a little bit about this last time I was on, but we're just getting there, I think, where we have science to begin to let us even think about that question with some, with some good data and not just, get a bunch of people in a room and I think and I believe and this might work and just sort of shoot from the hip. So I think we're headed that direction, and I think yes, absolutely. There's room for more sanctuary done well in the context of not big huge areas that are closed to hunting or closed to all human recreation of all kinds, but that are done with portions that are open, portions that are in sanctuary, and so we can support multiple uses. I do think that there's probably a lot of room for more of that.
Yeah. Because I think about a lot with some of the private places that I've visited before. Especially once you get beyond a certain size too. That those are kind of unique places because it's a tough question to ask because they will always ask, well, I don't really have a designated sanctuary. Do I need to add one? And I mean, I've been on some that are 5,000 or 6,000 acre properties, and it's just people hunting with their family, every weekend of the duck season, and they're kind of bouncing around wherever the ducks are on the property. And you're like, well, I don't really know if that level of disturbance is really going to push birds off of your whole place, And so for a good bit of like 5-6 days of the week, the whole property is, undisturbed other than normal. They may limit travel around the property on trucks and ATVs and whatnot, boats. And so you wonder in situations like that, like that's another thing we haven't probably have a good grasp on as far as valuation on this. There's some hunting that happens, but it's such a small amount of disturbance relative to the amount of available habitat, in that area, what does that influence? At what point do you cross a threshold where, you probably like, what hunt frequency do you have to be at to say you need a sanctuary, you need to take 25% of your property and not touch it, not ever go in there and hunt it, stay out of there?
It's a really good question, and it's hard to draw one line, but a paraphrase of a quote from a paper that's almost 30 years old, I think now, was something like sanctuary should be measured in weeks and not days, or maybe it was months and not days. I can't remember, but I really have kind of taken that to heart when we talk about sanctuary. It's not, hey, I'm going to have a sanctuary day and then 2 hunt days and a sanctuary day. That's not sanctuary. Maybe there's some effects at some places. The science isn't there to for us to make one conclusion about how that does or doesn't impact hunting success, really. But the science that we do have suggests that anything less than a week or two, we don't have the return rates of waterfowl. So we know that abundance doesn't build up to those sanctuary levels until you get a week or sometimes 2 weeks out from one of those major disturbance events like sanctuary.
And I think
like a hunt day.
Yeah.
I think
that's probably what
that works really well.
Yeah. That's probably what those really large landowners with this, a very low hunt density are probably in. Like if you were to say, when was the last time you hunted where you're hunting this morning? It could have been 3 weeks, since they hunted that particular spot, if they're really bouncing around the property a lot. And so, yeah, they might be getting at that several weeks where they haven't been in there, haven't disturbed them. But yeah, you're right. It definitely is that longer term, because we've monkeyed with a lot of that, with state agencies and stuff in certain areas saying, okay, well, can we do 2 days versus 4 days? And, and it always seemed like, you can shoot a number of holes in those studies, I'm sure, that have, those types of evaluations where they break, have certain days of the week that they're hunting areas and whatnot. But overall, I think even those would kind of more tend to show that the more consecutive days you put in between hunt days, is going to be more value added than anything. And I think you're right that you get in the terms of weeks, that's when you're going to not lose ducks. You're going to hold birds. Yeah.
I think another big challenge to the thinking is it's kind of species and landscape nested, if you will. And for example, think about pintails, coastal Louisiana. Think about the history. Just 30 years ago, the really great stuff that Cox and Afton did, and their advice on rest areas and these areas, like they wrote up, I think pintails burn 1/5 of their gas tank at night to go get fuel. And so trying to build kind of like the paper you guys did, Heath, and we always talk about this in terms of sanctuaries, but island biogeography, how many few big ones versus how many small ones, all that kind of stuff. And what's, I guess, becoming even more scary, if you just think about the coastal wetlands and what we're losing, look at the changes in rice production and agricultural production. All the white-fronted geese now basically shifting up here to the MAV tells you something, right? And we're losing coastal wetlands, and you've got a bird that historically, that's one of its prime wintering areas. And it's like there's so much harvest pressure. There's harvest pressure in Mexico. That's just one example of one species, but it's like, how do you deal with that? And you can't write refuge and management plans per se, or at least right now, we typically don't write it for one species unless it was like critically imperiled or something like that. But man, pintail, they're facing, and let's say hypothetically, as we go west, it's going to get drier and drier and hotter. It's like the birds are just getting pinched. And you got to believe that safe space, good habitat, safe space with food has to matter. How much compared to mallards? It's kind of funny too. You think about green-winged teal. We love to hunt them. We love to eat them. They rank up there in a lot of harvest, and yet we probably know less about their breeding ecology than a lot of other birds because of where they nest. It's like we don't wake up worrying about green-winged teal, but usually a lot of shallow water grass management benefits teal, right? But it's like pintail are even a much bigger challenge, and we tend not to worry about mallards too much. Mallards are going to do what they do. And teal, they seem to be plentiful. But birds like pintail and widgeon, those, especially when you're talking about coastal estuaries and marshes, it's kind of scary. It's like, what's the future? What's the crystal ball hold? And so anyway, more fodder and more thoughts with no answers.
Exactly right. Yeah. Pintail is a hard one, right? The nesting ecology is more challenging for us to deal with. Super early migrant. For instance, this year, I know I'm getting off subject, but this year we think maybe with the later rain and large portion of the prairie pothole region, we may have had a lot of overflight, and those birds go further north to areas that are potentially less productive nesting areas, or maybe a bunch of pintail forgo nesting. What do we do about that? That's largely outside of our management control. And so the question is, if would sanctuaries have benefited, those scenarios this year, done anything for those birds? Probably not, in a scenario where the breeding habitat was very limited early in the year when they were prospecting for nesting areas and brood ponds and such. And so pintail is a hard one. I agree.
Here's another, along the lines of how big, where they should be distributed, kind of another challenge to sanctuaries is we can really account for those areas that are posted, right? We know that on Cache River, there's X thousands of acres as inviolate sanctuary. White River, up and down the flyway, right? Every refuge, every state area, maybe not every one of them, but a good portion of them have some spatial context of sanctuary. Like Heath was saying earlier, you can't go in there past October 15th and basically try not to go in there at all. The other one that's really hard to account for and it matters is the private lands, and we know there's all these scenarios, right? Oh, we only hunt Monday, California hunts Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday. There's a lot of duck clubs in the MAV that may only hunt a few days, or they may hunt every day until 9 o'clock. So there's all these different scenarios, and how birds respond to that is kind of a mystery. I mean, you can see patterns with radio telemetry, but without really knowing that, hey, that refuge or that WMA is a sanctuary. That's probably why those birds are there. A lot of times on private lands, we may not really know that. We can kind of infer that there's probably areas probably not being hunted. And so the private lands are really difficult to quantify, but we know they've got to be an important part of that matrix, and that's, other than really doing experiments to really ask that question, good and bad food quality, small, big, frequency of hunting. Those are a little bit more difficult to disentangle, but collectively, the private landowner, for the most part, in general, has got to be doing a lot of great things for the resource when you're managing water, managing habitat. I mean, we can't carry these birds on state and federal areas. So obviously most of the landscape is privately owned, but then quantifying exactly how birds read that and use that. And again, what's sort of the demographic outcome? And I guess the simplest demographic is how many survive until, after January 31st, right? We quit hunting them. So it's a little more difficult, but it's like we encourage people to do it, right? We encourage you to have sanctuary. I mean, because we think it is a good thing, and it probably is a good thing. It's really a tough one to kind of disentangle.
It's really good point, and we struggle to have a bunch of data laying around to help us get at some of those questions. I'll just make a note of something that we've got some aerial survey data, and Brian, you might talk about this too. I know you've dealt a lot and had lots of students that are in postdocs that have worked with MBWF&P aerial survey data. But for the last 5 or 6 years now, we've been doing a pretty comprehensive National Wildlife Refuge survey in the Southeast region, and we fly our refuges, our sanctuary areas, and our hunt areas, anything that's waterfowl habitat through a stratified design in the Carolinas and some in Florida, in the MAV, all the way up to even in Illinois. And so it covers a large geographical area. What's super interesting is that some of the states have really good design. Mississippi is one of them. Arkansas is another good one, another good design survey. A portion of Louisiana has a good design survey. So we can estimate what the percentage of birds that are sitting on refuges, on national wildlife refuges, mostly in sanctuary, compared to the rest of the landscape. And that rest of the landscape includes state WMA sanctuaries, private sanctuaries, hunted areas, but that's just any other water. What's really interesting is while it varies in space and time over the about 5 or 6 years of the survey, what we found is only about a quarter of the birds that we've estimated have been on National Wildlife Refuge sanctuaries, meaning 3/4 or 75% of those birds are sitting somewhere else. Yes, those are in other sanctuaries some of the time, but that's not 74 of the 75%. A large portion of those birds are sitting in hunted areas, in sort of non-designated sanctuary. They've just gotten away from people, found a space where people haven't found them yet. They're really hard to get to, something like that. Large areas of the Cache or White River, for instance, are just, they've just gotten away from people and sort of found some of these natural sanctuaries. So that's a really interesting little factoid that I like to throw out there. Sometimes people talk about sanctuaries. Oh, they're holding all the ducks. You're hiding all the ducks in refuges. It's just not true at all. Yes, a substantial portion, especially in some regions, use those National Wildlife Refuge sanctuaries, but it's not most. It's not even half. Sometimes it's far less than a quarter in some areas. And even when they do, refuges don't have enough food to support those. Sometimes not nearly enough food. And what we usually plan for is something like 20 to 30% of the food for all those birds in that area. They have to go outside of those refuges and find food and move around the landscape to survive. And so I just wanted to kind of quantify that for folks, that such a large portion of birds, yes, a lot sit on sanctuaries during the day, but they're going to move around the landscape at night. And those surveys are only during the day, of course. And there's a lot outside of these designated sanctuaries in places just like Brian was describing.
So you were comparing radio mark GPS data with your survey?
This is just survey data. What we did was we compared our refuge surveys to the larger state surveys in the same area. So, for instance, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, we were they had a region of the Delta that they surveyed, of the Mississippi River floodplain, and we had surveyed all of the National Wildlife Refuge sanctuaries in there, and then just expressed that as a proportion of the of the total. Same thing with the Mississippi Delta.
Man, that'd be a great magazine article. You need to, just give them the simple statistics and like, here's what we found. That's, I think, really informative. Yeah,
I'll send you the data. Fully supported.
Fully supported.
I haven't heard the fully support in a while. That takes me back grad school days. But no, to what you were just saying there, Heath, I think is another thing that folks don't think about a lot is these birds' ability to figure out how to get away, even if it's not on what we think of as a sanctuary, like on a National Wildlife Refuge or on a state managed area. That's one thing I know I learned in all the years that I was in the survey planes flying in Mississippi is ducks are in some weird places that you wouldn't expect them to be. They know how to get away from pressure. So when that pressure's on them, they know that they will go into those little bios and slashes in places and deep in even in the hunt areas, deep enough in there, that they find their little bit of sanctuary in that. And then on top of that, the other part of, we're not watching these birds throughout the night. They figure out their, places to go at night and feed and forage and, escape some of that pressure too. So these birds are doing, a lot of things to avoid that pressure. So that's a whole nother element of it that we don't capture very well sometimes with folks.
There's a lot of anecdotes, but during Joe Lancaster's radio mark study, we actually got permission to capture birds near York Woods. And it just happened to be there were a bunch of them piled up. We could get to them, but we got authorization to do it. And we're kind of laughing. We're like, well, here's a bias sample. They're just going to pick up and flop over in the York Woods and never leave. And I don't remember, Joe could remember maybe 2 or 3. I don't remember how many birds, but this was literally on the border of York Woods, and none of those birds ever went to York Woods. They went west and south. So it's like, go figure, you've got one of the most well-managed private lands around, and yet, that little cadre of birds never went on there. So anyway, They find their safe space.
They do. It is super interesting too. We were talking a little bit on the previous podcast about how small, relatively small, those home ranges typically are compared to what I thought, and I think almost everyone thought they would be. I remember seeing some of Joe Lancaster's results that Brian was referencing and going, they seemed, those home ranges seem pretty small. Yeah, you get some birds that are going down to the South Delta from the north, but a lot of them are, staying really close within a few miles of a sanctuary and just back and forth day and night from areas that they've learned. They learn that area, they get there, and they kind of stay there, And then there have been a bunch of subsequent studies, and what's super interesting is there's just not much switching, even of refuges, right? So we think, ducks figure out an area, they fly up high, way over the hunters. They fly over and straight down again. Why would they not go to another sanctuary that's 20 miles away? There seems no reason that it couldn't. They just maybe flew 800 miles, south, from Canada down to Mississippi. Why couldn't they get up and move and switch sanctuaries? But they don't do it much. And this is a mallard perspective, because that's what we'd marked, right? Green-winged teal probably a little bit different. But that's super interesting because there's a cost to doing that. They have to learn that landscape, and they don't get to do it wrong. They do it wrong one time, they may die, right? They don't. There's not a lot of margin for error for figuring out these new landscapes. So there's a big risk factor to moving to a different landscape. And what's, I think, super interesting too about these sanctuaries is that we haven't, all this telemetry data, GSM data. It's not suggesting that there's a bunch of movement across the river, right? I remember we started some of the Tennessee Tech, the Cohen Wildlife Lab work in West Tennessee a number of years ago, and I was helping mark birds on Chickasaw National Wildlife Refuge and some surrounding areas right there. Big Lake Refuge is not far as a duck flies. 20 miles, 15, I don't know exactly, but it's close, right? And almost no birds moved between Chickasaw Refuge and some of those state WMAs right there over to Big Lake WMA and Big Lake National Wildlife Refuge. There's no good reason, biological reason, or maybe biological, but no physical barrier. It's not far. They weren't making those switching moves, and then subsequently lots of additional transmitters deployed on the landscape. Same thing in different areas. They're just not. It's super interesting how they're going to these sanctuaries and they learn that landscape, and there's such a negative feedback. There's such a risk of trying to go learn a new landscape with a risk of mortality that they're just not doing it. I think that's been one of the most surprising things that I've seen in the last 10 years with all this work that's come out, sort of starting with some of Joe Lancaster's work in Mississippi Delta and ongoing now with what the Cohen Lab's doing and what Doug Osborne is doing over in Arkansas, and other researchers, Mark Ballard and other folks are doing in Texas and out in California. So super interesting stuff. Just they do interesting things, and when we think we have them figured out, we tend to be wrong.
Yeah, those first couple of years of Joe's study, like Muscadine, Howard Miller, right there down Highway 1, right up against the Mississippi River. We'd laugh, like, what are they going to do? They're going to pick up, fly over the trees, over the river to 1.5 million acres of rice just across the river. And like you're saying, Heath, amazingly, later in the year, Joe had a few birds that would traverse over there, but it wasn't like we just happened to catch them there and they really want to be in Arkansas. I mean, they never, and a bunch of the birds south of Highway 82, which for listeners later on, that's like one of the major east-west highways through the Delta. Most of those birds stayed south. And then in a couple other years of his studies, we trapped birds mostly in the north, and very few of them came south. It's like these cohorts. So there is a lot of sedentary, I guess, learned behavior, predictability. I guess the only thing I will say I really do know about ducks is there is a lot of individual variation. Some birds love to rove, they move around. But yeah, mallards, when you look at a lot of the data, there are some individuals that they zip around, but a good core of them, though, tend to really be pretty kind of predictable in their movement. So there is a lot of individual variation, and probably more so in other species like teal and maybe pintail and things like that. But no, it's fun. It's interesting.
We
I
were
agree.
talking about that the
So go
last
ahead,
time
James.
he was here. We were talking about that very thing about, not moving around a whole lot, but that's kind of more of the rule, and the exception is a lot of what we tend to see on social media and other things when they were doing these studies. Look at this crazy movements this mallard is doing. It's bouncing all over the place, or it made this huge movement from here to there. And because that's what's cool, if it's just like, hey, it moved between these three places every day for, 3 weeks, that's not very exciting or sexy probably to promote on something. People like to see those kind of cool, unique things that are going on in nature. And so I think a lot of times, from what somebody would look if they're looking to a lot of these movement studies, especially now that we have the technology, we're putting maps and showing those movements online. You get the impression that these birds are, being super highly mobile, all the time and doing some squirrely stuff. And that's really not the rule, that's kind of more the exception, that most of these birds probably are, like Heath had said, a little lazy, just kind of hanging out in these typical spots, not moving around a whole lot. And I think that's what seems to be, when birds first move into here, if you're hunting on a flight day, probably those birds are settling, coming off a front. And, that's probably, obviously the day to be out there. They probably may have been in that landscape before in the year, but it's been a year since they've been there, and they're just kind of trying to settle it out, figure it out. But once they get settled, they probably pretty well know what they're doing every day.
Yep.
Well, Phyllis, we've been at it for a little bit. So, I think we can, I told Brian that we were going to shoot for 45 minutes. And so
Pretty
we've
close.
we've hit that mark a little bit. We've got a great conversation about it. And I knew going into it, this conversation would be a lot like this, because there's just like we joked about the last time Heath was here about saying it depends a lot. This episode may be a lot of the, well, we just don't know that kind of aspect of it.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one. And it like I said, it's a very difficult thing to measure, all these things we're talking about. I mean, setting up studies to get at these questions would be extremely difficult. I mean, most of the studies out there on what few, to Heath's point, not that many, but most of them that are either about sanctuary or, managing hunting disturbance or anything, there's probably quite a bit of things you could say, well, they didn't control for this or that. And it's like, well, how do you control for a lot of the things that influence these questions, our ability to get at these questions? So there's a lot of unknowns for sure.
I agree, and just to kind of in closing, sounds like we're moving that way, James. But I want to give a shout out to all the researchers who are trying to tackle this, not this question, but these difficult questions. Right, Dr. Davis and his labs delved into them. Doug Osborne, Brad Cohen, Bart Ballard, many others. I'm sure I missed a bazillion, but lots of folks are thinking about this. The results are going to vary, whether you're in a migration area or a wintering area, what species you look at, what the goal of the sanctuary is, right? Is it more about trying to affect bird distribution on the landscape? Are we trying to address maybe biological challenges, more like what we might do with a pintail versus a mallard, moving them around the landscape? So all of these things vary. It depends, right, James? All of these things vary, and but just a big shout out to the state and federal agents, private landowners, so on and so forth, pouring resources in, trying to figure out to help us, to help agencies better manage our resources, both biologically for the birds, and also for the hunters and other non-consumptive recreationists that really enjoy the resource.
Well said, Heath. But for sure, we're very fortunate that we have right now so many great professionals out there looking into these questions and doing this work, and then so many agencies and private individuals putting those, financial and other resources towards helping those scientists address those questions. So for sure, hats off to everyone involved in our continued efforts to learn more about these ducks and see how we can help them. So, well, Heath, again, always a pleasure to have you on. And so we need to probably get together more often. Again, like I said the last time you were here, maybe sampling some birds near your current location, do a podcast from up there. We may need to move it up there again. So.
I think October 2025 would be a wonderful time to do a follow-up and maybe in the Happett office in Bismarck, North Dakota.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and just pencil that in right now. I'll put my leave in. But anyway, Heath, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule,
Pleasure.
especially on the late afternoon today. And I'm sure we'll have you back again at some point in time. And I'll be going ahead and thinking about what all I need to pack, come up there for that hunting trip. So
You mean the podcast trip, right?
yeah, podcast trip. That's right, not hunting, sampling and podcast trip. So all right, well, thanks, Heath.
Thanks, James. Thanks,
Appreciate
Brian.
it.
Thanks, you guys. Good to see you.
Thanks for joining us on Game Bird University Podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_GameBird or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Game Bird Program.